Hello guys, today we are going to the movie review. Movie name is Hard to Hold 1984 full movie. Certainty here is a comprehensive review of the film's adaptation of Gore Julia Orwell's 1984 titled Hard to Hold 1984. Full movie Hard to Hold in a lesser non-cinematic adaptation inspired by George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 on Orwell's chilling vision of totalitarianism. Plot overview. The film attempts to stay true to original story, focusing on Winston Smith, a low-ranking member of the party living under the oppressive surveillance state of Oceania. Winston's growing disillusionment with the party and his clandestine rebellions against its control for the core of the narrative. The films explore themes of consumership, propaganda, loss of individuality, and the omnipresent watch of Big Brother performance. The lead actor delivers a compelling portrayal of Winston, capturing the emotional turmoil and internal conflict of a man trapped under an oppressive regime. Supporting characters including Julia and O'Brien are portrayed with varying degrees of depth, or some critics feel their development could have been more fleshed out. Could have been finished out. Direction and cinematography. The director adopts a black and abrasive visual style, emphasizing the omnipresent surveillance and the sterile environment of Oceania. The use of shadow and muted color palettes effectively evoke a sense of despair and conformity. However, pacing issues are noticeable at times, with certain sequences feeling sluggish or overly draws out themes and message. The film successfully highlights the driving power of authorization, regimes, and the importance of free thoughts and individuality. It underscores overall warning about the dangers of absolute government control and the obliteration of truth production value. Will the film's set design and costume convincingly depict and dystopian worlds? Some special effects and production elements appear dated or low budget, which might retrace from the immersive experience for some viewers. Overall impressions Hard to Hold offers as a haunting and thought-provoking interpretation. 1984 thought it may to match the grandeur or depth of more exclaimed adaptations, it remains a value cinematic reflection on Orwell's warnings. Fans of dystopian cinema of Orwell works will find these films worth watching for its earnest attempt to bring the novel's selling words to life. Rating 9.5. 3.5 and would you like more detailed realistic certainty? Hard to hold 1984 full movie review. Overview. Hard to Hold is a lesser known cinematic adaptation inspired by George Orwell's seminal dystopian novel 1984, released in the early 1980s. The film attempts to translate overall breaks. Hearthold is a lesser-known cinematic adaptation inspired by George Orwell's seminal dystopian novel 1984, released in plot and narrative depth. The films follow Wisdom Smith, portrayed as a disillusioned and oppressed government work living in Ocean's society under the relentless of Big Brother's Winston internal struggle against the oppressive regime is central of the narrative as he secretly questions the party dogma. He becomes involved in covert rebellions which ultimately led to his tragic downfall. The screenplay strives to stay true to Overall's original themes: censorship, the manipulation of truth, and the obliterations of individuality. However, some critics argue that the film's plot. Sorry, guys. To screenplays right to stay true overall original themes: censorship, the manipulation of truth, and the obliterations of individuality. However, some critics argue that the film's plot will somewhat condensed or simplified, lacking the layered complexity of overall novel. Certain scenes are rushed and movie the psychology tension. Supporting characters Julia Roberts and others are verifying degrees of portrayed with borrowing degrees of depth. Julia's characters supporting characters Julia O'Brien and others are portrayed with varying degrees of depth. Julia's characters often a symbol of defiance and desire for freedom is somewhat underdeveloped, which diminishes the emotional impact of Western's rebellions. O'Brien's sinister presence is palpably thought. Some viewers find his characters emotional, motivational, somewhat ambiguous, or underexplored. Overall, the performance served the story well but could have benefited from more nuanced characters development to deepen viewer engagement. Director visual directors. Some viewers find this character's motivation somewhat explored. Overall, the performance of the story well, but could have benefit from more nuanced characters development to deepen viewer engagement. Director visual style and cinematography. The directors adopts a stark, aggressive visual aesthetic that aligns well with the novel's atmosphere. The use of bleak muted color palettes, gray, black, white, and dull brown creates a sterile, dehumanized environment that emphasizes the societal control and loss individuality. Cinematography is characterized by cult cinematic framing, utility, shadows, and harsh lightings to evoke a sense of paranoia and surveillance. Camera angles frequently reinforce the themes of watchfulness, with shots often depicting and the omnipresent screens and looming poster of Big Brother. Will the visual style effectively immerse viewers in overall dystopian world? Some sequence suffers from pacing issue with prolonged scenes that may test viewers' patience. Additionally, certain special effects and set designs appear dated for or long budget, which can detract from the overall immersion. Themes and symbolism. Hmm, Guys, this movie's themes and I talk this movie's themes and symbolism. The film excels at highlighting the core themes of overall 1984. It underscores the dangers of unchecked governmental authority, the manipulations of truth, thought propagandas, and the destruction of privacy and personal freedom. Particularly power are scans depicting the screen constant surveillance and the parties in propaganda, which serve as stark visuals reminders of the regime's omnipresence. The films also explore the psychological manipulations of individual, highlighting how fear and conformity suppress dissent. However, some thematic elements such as party ideologically controlled are presented somewhat straightforwardly, lacking the layered subtlety found in overall novel production value. The production design effectively depicts the dystopian environments with convincingly bleak sets and costumes that evoke a society stripped of color and individuality. The use of practical effects thought limited by the era's technology succeed in creating a sense of claustrophobia and suppressive. However, the film's budget constraints are apparent and in some special effects and visual effects sequence which appear somewhat primitive by modern standards. These limitations will understandable my lesson the immersive experience of a contemporary audience accustomed to more polished visual impact and cultural significance. Hard to Hold is a film that attempts to confront viewers with overall warnings about government's overreach and erosions of truth, feeling it may not be as influential or widely recognized as other dystopian films. It serves as a stark reminder of overall insight into authoritarian regimes. It is also noteworthy as a reflection of 1980s cinematic trends where filmmakers sought to explore dystopian as allegories for contemporary political climate. Despite its flaws, the film's earnest portrayals of overall themes lends it certain cultural and educational value. Final verdict: this movie, Hard to Hold 1984, is a commendable but imperfect adaptation of 1984. It offers a visually compelling, thematically faithful depiction of overall grim universe thought is occasionally suffers from pacing issue, limited characters development, and budget constraints. Fans of dystopian cinema overall work or thus interested in political allegories will find value in this film's earnest attempts to bring overall warning to life. While not a definitive cinematic masterpiece, it remains a thought-provoking piece that encourages reflections on the importance of individual freedom and the dangers of Hard to Hold 1984 in-depth full movie review. Introduction and text: Hard to Hold is a relatively obscure film adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, a novel that has become a cornerstone of dystopia literature. Released in the early 1980s, the film was an ambitious project aiming to bring Orwell's chilling vision of a totalitarian future to the screen. While it did not garner the same critical or commercial success as other dystopian adaptations, it remains a noteworthy attempt, especially considering the limitations of its production eras and budget. The film's release comes at a time when Cold War tensions and fears of government overreach were prominent in the cultural constitution, making its themes particularly resonant. Its aim was to serve both a cautionary tale and reflections of contemporary fears about surveillance, censorship, and loss of personal freedom. I tell you guys this plot summary and nation structure. The, the narrative closely follows Wisdom Smith played with earnestness and internal conflict by the lead actor, a low-level members of the party. In Ocean Wisdom, our daily life is characterized by strict conformity, privacy, surveillance, and relentless propaganda. His clandestine thought of rebellions and desires for truth set the stage for a tragic arc of awakening and Julia's fellow dissenter and his encounters with O'Brien, a party official who appears to be sympathetic but ultimately reveals himself as an agent of the regime. The film explores Winston's internal struggle, his yearning for freedom versus the crushing power of the party while staying faithful to the novel's core themes. The screenplay simplifies some of Orwell's complex ideas, resulting in a more straightforward narrative. Certain philosophically debates and nuanced characters' motivation are considered or omitted, which might be viewed as a loss of depth but also as practical choice for the film's medium. Guys, I tell you this characters development and performance. The performance of Winston is pivotal to the film's impact. The actors convincingly portrays Winston's emotional turmoil, his paranoia, and the gradual erosion of his sense of self. His portrayals capture the despair and fleeting hope of a man living under a suffocation regime. Julia's characters often are symbols of rebellion and desire for personal happiness. It portrays with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. However, her character's development feels somewhat limited, primarily surviving as a plot device rather than a fully fleshed out individual who playing the sinister party figure executes an unsettling Christmas embodying the regime's manipulative powers. His interaction with wisdom awoke a sense of psychological torment, although some viewers might find his character's motivation vague of underdeveloped. Secondary characters such as the party members and tailscreen operators are depicted mainly through visual cues and brief dialogues, emphasizing the dehumanizing environment of ocean. I tell you this, guys. Visual styles, cinematography, and atmosphere. One of the film's strongest aspect is its visual aesthetic. Its visual aesthetic. The director employs a black, oppressive styles that effectively impress viewers in the dystopian worlds. The use of color palettes dominates by gray, white, blacks, and dull earth tones reinforce the themes of conformity, suppressions, and desk-based cinematography techniques such as the frequent use of wide, cold shots and geometric framing serve to evoke feeling of surveillance and control. Sorts of telescreens, posters of Big Brothers and crowd of instruction criticize creates an atmosphere of constant watchful and loss of privacy. Crowd lighting is often stark and harsh with shadows cast across characters' faces, symbolizing the omnipresence of fears and desperation. The camera often sees it a disaster during moments of psychological tension, emphasizing the alienation of individuals within the system, while the aesthetic effectively capture Orwell's Black Universe. Some sequence suffers from pacing issue. Several scenes are overly long for repetitive, which can cause viewers fatigue. Additionally, the special effects limited by the technology capability of the era appears dated, which can lessen immersion for modern audience accustomed to high quality CGI. I tell you guys this themes, symbolism, and message. Hard to Hold Axel is translating the novel's core themes onto the screens. Surveillance and control, the omnipresent telescreens and the party, constant monitoring, symbolism, the loss of privacy, the film visual emphasizing this aspect thought numerous shots of watchful eye and looming screens, manipulations of truth, the parties controls our information, altering history and reverting records is depicted repetitive environments and the superations of personal expressions, psychology, repressions, and fear. The films capture the psychology toll of living under constant threats with scans emphasizing paranoia, the internal conflict. However, some thematic elements such as the philosophically debates about truth, consequence, and rebellions are present, straying forwardly, taking the layered substance of overall's original novel. Okay, guys, this movie production design and technical element I speak you. The production design effectively evoke a dystopian society. Sets are minimalistic but functional, emphasizing the blackness and suppressions endemic to oceans. The costume uniforms in trap color underlines the loss of individuality. Sound design complements the visual tone with a sparse score and emission noise that heighten tension and use the use of negative sound like the constant hum of telescreens reinforce the oppressive atmosphere. Limitation in special effects and budget are noticeable. For example, scans involving propaganda, broadcast, or surveillance visuals are sometimes rudimentary, which may detract from the film's realism. Nonetheless, practical effects and makeup are used effectively to craft a convincing dystopian world's cultural and political relevance. Hard to Hold serves as a stark cautionary tales about the dangers of authoritarianism and unchecked government power. Its themes remains relevant, especially in an era where surveillance, data manipulation, and political censorship. I tell you guys, this comparison to other adaptations compared to others adaptation of 1984 such as Mitchell's Redford's 1984 film released in 1984 or the 1956 version. The 1984 Hard to Hold is less polished out, more which screens in its visual storytelling. It lacks the depth and nuance of the moral acclaimed adaptations but competes with a raw, uncompromised aesthetic. The 1984 film is often praised for its widely or to Orwell's themes, thought it sometimes sacrificed narrative complexity for visual impact. It remains a useful visual supplement to the literary works, even it doesn't fully captures the novel's philosophically subtle strength and weakness. I tell you this strength and weakness. Strength. Oh, one time this strength. Visual compelling and atmospheric, faithful to core themes of 1984, strong performance, especially from the lead character actor, effective use of lighting and set design to evoke operations, timely and relevant message about surveillance and authoritarianism, weakness pacing in. Effective, timely strictness, pacing issue, and occasionally slow sequence limited character development for supporting roles. Some special effects appear outdated, simplified narrative that omits some philosophical depth, budget constraints that effective visual quality. Final verdict. I tell you this final verdict. Okay, Hard to Hold 1984 is a commendable but imperfect adaptation of Orwell's 1984. It captures the complex atmosphere and of the novels with visual flair and earnest performance. While it may not reach the height of other novels, adaptations for all fully explores the philosophical nuance of Orwell's works. It remains a powerful tool that encourages reflection on the dangers of authoritarianism, surveillance, and the suppression of truth for fans of dystopian cinema. Orwell's emphasizes or thus instead in political allegories hard to hold upper, hard to hold offer windscreen experience that despite importance of safeguarding freedom and truth. Final rating 93.5 on. Introduction and historical context. I tell you, Hardwood is an obscure film adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, a dystopian masterpiece that has profoundly influenced literature, cinema, and political discourse. Released in 1984, the film entered landscapes rife with Cold War anxiety, unsecured our government surveillance, and debates about personal freedom versus state control. Despite its modest reception and limited theatrical release, Hard to Hold aims to visually embody Orwell's bleak universe, a society where the government exercise absolute power, manipulation truth, and erasing individually its production. History reflects the challenge of translating Orwell's complex themes into a cinematic form, especially gives the technologically and budgetary constraints of the era. The films earned eight times when the world was grappling with fears of accusations, secret police, and mass propaganda, making its themes resonate strongly with contemporary audience. The film's intent has was only to certainty, but also to survey as a commentary tales warning viewers about the potentially consequences of unchecked government's overreach. I tell you this plot and narration analysis. The narrative closely follows Winston Smith, a quiet and introspective man working at the Ministry of Truth, where his jobs involve revolting history of fit the party's never changing narrative. The film opens with stark imagery of surveillance technology, telescreens, hidden microphones, and propaganda portions of Big Brother setting an ominous tone as Winston begins to secretly accuse the party's version of reality. He becomes involved with Julia, a fellow dissenters who embodies rebellion spirit and desires for personal freedom. Their clandestine meeting symbolizes the fragile human craving for truth and love in a society designed to suppose both. The plot thickness as distance disillusionment deepens, leading him into the underground resistance movement. His interactions with O'Brien's high-ranking party members, highlighting the psychological manipulation employed by the regime. O'Brien's roles as both mentoring as tormentor underscore the themes of desperation, how authority can disguise itself as detachment will secretly or string control. The climax involves Winston's arrest, torture and re-educations, an intense sequence emphasizing psychologically and physically represents. The ending leaves Winston broke, a shell of his former self, illustrating the tragic victory of tutorial power over individual autonomy. Quite faithful to overall core message, the screenplay simplifies some philosophical debates, focusing instead on visual, imaginary, and emotional beats. This programmatic approach makes the films aspirational but sacrifices some of the novel's layered complexity, especially its nuanced explores of truth, conscience, and resistance. And this characterizations and action, the performance is hard to hold a central to its emotionally impact. The lead actor's portrayals of Winston is announced, capturing his internal conflict with subtle gestures and expressions. His descent from hopeful rebellions to despair is palpable, effectively conveying the psychological toll of living under constant surveillance. Julia portrays as a spirited yet vulnerable woman's symbolism, hope, and defines her chemistry with Winston's and emotionally weight, although her character remains somewhat underdeveloped, serving more as symbols of rebellion than a fully fleshed out individual. O'Brien's character is portrayed with sinister gravitas as his claim calculating demons, escalations, the manipulations power of the enemy. The actor's performance effectively communicates the duality of O'Brien's roles both as a mentor and a producer, highlighting the regime skeptically of psychologically supporting characters such as party members, telescreens operators, and thought police are depreciated, thought brief but effective visual cues. Their uniforms appearance and robotic behavior emphasize the dehumanizing environment of Oceania. Visual style, cinematography, and atmosphere. One of the film's standout features is its visually aesthetic. The director employs a minimalistic yet oppressive styles that impress viewers in the dystopia universe. The use of muted color palettes, primarily grays, reds, blacks, and rose, evokes a sense of blankness and monotony, reinforcing themes of conformity and separation. Cinematography technique includes wide-angle shots that showcase the vast impersonal cityscapes, reinforce the idea of a society under constant surveillance. Framing often uses geometric patterns, rows of identical buildings, symmetrical sense to symbolism, the loss of individuality. Lighting is stark and often shadows, creating a mood of paranoia and unease. The frequent use of Cyrus constant emphasize the internal conflict within characters and the moral ambiguity of the regime. Certain sequences, as the fact of Big Brother watching from posters or telescreens, are shot with a sense of menace and omnipresence. The films also employs innovations, camera angles during moments of psychologically torment, highlighting the sense of disorientation. While the visual style is effective and atmosphere, while the visual style some sequence suffers from pacing issue, lingering shots or repetitive scans that can test viewers' patience. Additionally, especially effects limited by technology of the era sometimes appears crude or unconvincing, which can distract from the overall impressions, themes, and symbolism. Hard to hold is rich in symbolism that shows overall original themes, surveillance, the omnipresent telescreen symbolism, the loss of privacy. The film's visual emphasize is thought sorts of watchful eyes, microphones, and surveillance corridors, creating an atmosphere of constant security. Language and thoughtful. The concept of newspeak controlled language is designed to limit thought. It visually represents thought sense of government propaganda and restrictive dialogues, emphasizing how language shapes consequences, individuality versus conformity, the uniformity of consumer architecture and behavior despite the suppressions of per- personal identity, Winston's internal struggle to maintain his thought symbolized resistance against the homogeneous, psychologically controlled torture. Scans and Winston's mental breakdown showcase how fear and psychological manipulation serve as tools for education. The films also employs visual metaphor such as shattered mirror and broken clocks to symbolize fractures, indebtedness, and the erasures of personal history. Production designs and technical aspects. The production designs effectively for dystopian society sets are minimal but functional, crowded apartment, stark government building, and impersonal public space. The costumes are artillery reflection and the uniformity and suppressions of individuality. Sound design complements the visually stunning ambient noise mechanisms and lessons. Sirens evoke the constant presence of surveillance and control. The sparse musical scores amplifies moment of tensions and introspections. I tell you this cultures and political signification hard to hold functions as a stark warning against authoritarianism, censorship, and the manipulations of truth. Its themes remain starlighting relevant today in era of much data conclusions. The film serves as a reminder of Orwell's presence, inciting how governments can uh, distort reality, erode privacy, and suppose dissent. Its depictions of psychology, control, and propaganda issues modern debates over make names, government scary, and privacy rights. Furthermore, the film acts as a cultural artifact of the 1980s, reflecting societal anxiety about the Cold War, nuclear threats, and the potential for oppressive regimes to rise again. Comparison with the other adaptation compared to other versions such as Michelle Radford's 1984 of the 1956 telefilms Hard to Hold is less polished out but more visceral is in its visual storytelling. It emphasizing atmosphere or narrative complexity, making it more immersive in terms of mood but less detailed in philosophical exploration. Redford 1984, for instance, is lauded for its fidelity and nuanced performance, while Hard to Hold stands out for its raw, unfiltered descriptions of oppression. It's often viewed as a visually companion more unitful depiction of oppression. It's often viewed as a visual companion more visceral than cerebral nighting and terror and space of stand out for its raw, unfiltered depictions or operations. It's often viewed as a visually companion more visceral than silver, highlighting the terror and despite of Orwell's universe, strength and weakness. Strength. I tell you this strength visually completing and atmosphere faithful for core themes 1984 strong lead performance, effective use of lighting, set designs and cinematography, timing timeline and relevant themes about surveillance and atmospherism. I tell you this weakness, pacing issue and slow sequence, limited character development outside instance, especially effects to death, simplified narration at the expense of philosophically depth, budgetary constraint impacting visually quality. I tell you this final verdict recommendation to 1984 stand as a bold, visually arresting attempt to dramatize Orwell's 1984. Will it fall short of fully capturing the novel's philosophically nuanced and suffers from technical li- limitation, it succeeds in delivering a powerful depiction of comparison and psychologically control. Its value was for fans of dystopian cinema, Orwell's authors, and students of political philosophy. Its Winston's imagery and thematic focus make it a stark reminder of the importance of safeguarding individual freedoms against the encroachments of authority power. Over a rating 3.5 to 4 out of. Hard to Hold 1984, the most comprehensive and in-depth movie review, introduction and habituation visions of dystopia. Hard to Hold 1984 is an obscure ambitious cinematic adaptation of George Orwell's seminal dystopian novel 1984. It was released during a period marked by the heightened Cold War tensions, growing fears of government overreach, and widespread concerns about the erosion of personal privacy. The film sought to translate overall complexity, growing fears of government overreach, and widespread concerns about the erosion of personal privacy. The film sought to translate Orwell's complex layered narrative into a visually spectacle that would evoke the oppressive atmospheres of Ocean's a society under totalitarian control, produced with limited resource but driven by a desire to faithfully defeat overall nightmarish universe. Hard to Hold has remained a somewhat overlooked gems in the landscapes of dystopia cinema. Its themes, surveillance, propaganda, psychology, repressions, and the loss of individual identity are as relevant today as they were in the early 1980s, making in Films worth revisiting and analyzing in depth. I tell you this background and historical context. The early 1980s was a period of intense geopolitical tension with the Cold War at its peak. The fear of nuclear conflict, government scary and authoritarian regimes was prevailing in Western and Eastern societies alike. Media outlets exploring themes of government control, censorship, and manipulations of truth. In this climate, 1984 remains a powerful cultural touchstone. It's a depiction of a society under constant surveillance where truth is malleable and dissent is brutally support resonate deeply hard to hold present as a cinematic response an attempt to visually and emotionally embody overall warnings about the dangers of totalitarianism. With the film was not a commercial success and received mixed reviews. It has gained cult following among fans of dystopian cinema and Orwellian scholarship. Critics have loved its visual style and among fans dystopian cinema and Orwellian scholarship. Critics have loved its visual styles and atmosphere even as they acknowledged its narrative and technical shortcomings. I tell you this plot summary and narrative structure and overview. The film follows Winston Smith, a quiet and introverted man who works in the Ministry of Truth and Agency responsibility of reverting history to align with the party's ever-shifting narrative. The opening scans immediately immerse viewers in a blank, oppressive environment touring grey building, ubiquitous telescreens and propaganda posters of Big Brother dominate the landscape. Winston's internal world is one of suspension and quiet rebellion. His clandestine thought of defeated embodied in his secret journals are portrayed as dangerous and subversive act. His relationship with Julia's as spirited young woman who shared his clandestine desire for freedom become a symbol of hope amid despair. As the story unfolds, Winston begins to secretly explore forbidden truth-seeking evidence of the lies propagandas by the regime. These acts of rebellion leads him into contact with O'Brien's a high-ranking party member who appears to be sympathetic but ultimately reveals himself as an agent of the regime. Psychology control. The climax is harrowing. Winston's arrest, torture, and re-education at the Ministry of Love. The film's depictions of psychology torments highlighted thought intense visually and unsettling sound designs underscores the regime's brutal tactics. The story concludes with Winston's broken acceptance of the party. I tell you this category and acting performance depth in limited frame. The strength of Hard to Hold lies significantly in its performance, especially the portrayals of Winston. The lead actor's announced acting captures Winston's gradually psychology deteriorations oscillating between hope, doubt, fear, and despair. His physically expressions, furtive glance, trembling hands, and haunted eyes convey much of the internal conflict that Orwell's protagonist Edicure Julia's characters although somewhat underdeveloped, it portrayed with a fairy spirit that embodies human resilience and desires of for personal freedom. Her chemistry with Winston's conveyed thought, subtle gestures, and shared looks add emotional depth to the narration. O'Brien is convincingly sinister, embodying the duty of the regime's benevolence and brutality. His claim demeanor, coupled with an unsettling case escaped the psychologically manipulation at the heart of totalitarian control. Supporting characters such as the telescopes operations thought police and cities are depicted thought brief but effective visually cues. Their mechanical robotic behavior reinforce the dehumanizing environment of Oceania. Visual style, cinematography, and atmosphere crafting a dystopian pulse. Hard to hold excel in establishing a hunting oppressive atmosphere. Thought it's visually designed. The cinematography employs a cold, distinct colors palette, predominantly grays, whites, black, and muted tones that underscores the blackness of the society. The films make extensive use of wide-angle shots and symmetrical compositions, emphasizing the vastness and impersonal nature of oceans. Infrastructure scans of crowd public space with citizens moving in unison under watchful eyes portrays a society in which individuality is sacrificed for conformity. Length is often stuck in height contrasts, creating shadows that symbolize secrecy and psychologically represents the frequent use of chiaroscuro during moments of internal conflict heightens the emotional intensity. Key visually motifs include the ever-present telescreens posters of Big Brothers with the slogans Big Brother is watching you that the prevalence use of surveillance cameras elements that visually reinforce the themes of constant monitoring will the visual aesthetic in is impressive and effective. Some sequence suffer from pacing issues, length shorts there, linger unceasingly, or repetitive imagery that can challenge viewers' engagement. The especially effects contrast by the technology capability of the era essentially looks crowd for unconscious but are employed thoughtfully to evoke the dystopian atmosphere, theme, symbol, and message, analyzing the core ideas hard to hold faithful visually our pulse core themes surveillance and controls the omnipresent telescreen symbolize the loss of privacy and autonomy visually gives us as citizens constantly watching their surroundings evoke a sense of paranoia that pervades the society. Manipulations of truth, sense of instance, editing records, and rewriting history, highlighting the remains power to distort reality. The films underscores how truth become malleable under authoritarian rule, leading to collective amnesia, language, and thought. The concept of newspeak, restrictive language designed to limit thought. It represents thought, propaganda posters, slogans, and controlled dialogues, emphasizing the regime's effort to save consequences, loss of individuality, the homogeneity of costumes, article, and behavior visually convey the suppression of personal identity, instance, internal struggles to retain independence, thought, symbolize resistance against conformity, psychologically representations, and to scans, including the infamous rooms 101 depict the against brutal tactics to irradiate dissent and reshape the mind. Additional symbolism includes sacred mirrors representing fractious identities and clocks that are reliability broken or manipulated to symbolize the erasures of time and history, production design, and technical aspect, reflections of dystopia. The set designs is His fast but highly effective artillery furniture, draft uniforms, and abusive architecture above a society devoid of color, warmth, or individuality. Sound design is used to evoke energy, ambitions, noise, mechanical fumes, and distance. Series create a constant backdrop of surveillance and fear. The sparse musical score captures moment of tension, despair, and internal reflections give the era's technology limitations visual effects such as propaganda, broadcast surveillance visually and torture sequence appears somewhat rudimentary. Nonetheless, this effect serve their purpose, emphasizing the oppressive environment's culture and political relevance. The film's enduring message, despite its age hard to hold, remains strangely relevant. Its depictions of mass surveillance, government propaganda, and psychologically controlled issues presents day concerns about privacy rights, fake news, and state secrecy. The films function as a stark warning how easily societies can slide into authoritarianism when fear of language are especially uh, pertinent in an era of social media and information warfare. It also reflects anxieties about the potential for technology to be widely as a tool of operations. The telescopes and microphones symbolize modern concerns about data collection, government monitoring, and loss of autonomy. Comparison with other Orwellian adaptations and films, Hard to Hold is often contrasted with other adaptations. Mitchell Redford's his 1984's a more polished, critically acclaimed adaptation, the emphasizing philosophy, depth, and nuanced performance. Redford's version is a more faithful, is in tune and details, but hard to hold companies with visceral visually storytelling. 1956 tale films in earlier, less ambitious version that lacked the visually gravitas of later adaptations. Other dystopian films, movies like Brazil, Blade Runner, and A Clockwork Orange explore similar themes of societal control, but hard to hold remains unique in its direct visual embodiment of Corvus' narrative's strength and weakness, a critical perspective, strength visually arresting, immersive atmosphere, effective use of cinematography, lighting, and set designs, strong performance, especially from the lead actor. Faithful to core themes of 1984 theme, timeless relevance and politically significance evoke and wins kernel emotionally response. Weakness Facing issue with some sequence feeling slow or repetitive, limited characters development outside Western's, especially effect look date and sometimes unconvincing, simplifies complex philosophically debates, budget constraints limit visual and narrative scope, some dialogues and sketches lack subtlety, final verdict and essentially thought, played culture artificial. Hard to Hold 1984 is a bold, visually compelling attempt to bring Orwell's 1984 to life on screens while it falls short of capturing the full philosophic essence of the novels. It succeeds in creating a haunting, oppressive atmosphere that lingers in the viewer's mind. It's films that prompt reflection on the importance of truth, freedom, and privacy issue that remains urgent today despite its technical limitations. The film's visual imagery and thematic response make it a value watch for anyone interested in dystopia, narrative, political philosophy, or cinematic history. Overall rating 4 out of 5. Hard, Hard to Hold 1984, the most comprehensive and in-depth movie review, introduction and ambition vision of dystopia. Hard to Hold 1984 is an obscure yet ambitious cinematic adaptations of George Orwell's seminal dystopian novel 1984. It was released during release. Sorry guys, to wait adaptation yet provide marked by high heightened Cold War tensions, growing fears of government overreach, and widespread concern about the erosion of personal privacy. The film sought to translate Orwell's contrary the tear into a visually stunning and thought-provoking experience but ultimately fell short of its potentially background making of a cult classic. Hard to Hold was directed by Robert Longo, a relatively unknown filmmaker at the time who had previously worked as, as a painter and sculptor Longer's vision for the film was to create a visually striking representation of Orwell's novels incorporates a mix of live actions and animations to bring the dystopian world to life. The project was marked by controversy, with many critics and viewers questioning the film's artistic merit and commercial viability. Historically, context times of great change, the release of Hard to Hold in 1984 coincided with a awaited moment in world history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of communism and had left many questioning the nature of power and control. The film's themes of government, surveillance, propaganda, and the dangers of totalitarianism resonate deeply with audiences who were increasingly aware of the risk of unchecked thematic analysis exploring the dangers of a totalitarian society. At its core, Hard to Hold is a film about the dangers of a totalitarian society. The movies explore the ways in which government use propaganda, manipulations, and coercions to maintain control over their population. Thought the characters of Winston Smith, played by a relatively unknown actor at the time, the film raises important questions about the natures of freedom, individuality, and the importance of human rights. Technical critique, visually stunning but flawed assignment. From a technical perspective, Hard to Hold is a visually stunning achievement. The film's use to live action and animations create a unique and immersive world that is both captivating and unsettling. However, the film's pacing and editing are often criticized for being disjointed. The film's scores, composed by a relatively unknown musicians at the time, is quietly impressive but sometimes overwhelming. Influence and legacy, a cult classic that endures despite its initially commercial failure and critical backlash. Hard to Hold has developed a cult following over the years. The film's themes of government, surveillance, propaganda, and the dangers of totalitarianism continue to resonate with audience today. In recent years, the film has been revalued by critics and scholars who have recognized its importance as a pioneering work of dystopian cinema. Conclusions, a film ahead of its time. In conclusion, Hard to Hold is a film that was ahead of its times, released in an era marked by growing fears of government overreach and the erosion of personal privacy. The film themes of totalitarianism and the dangers of government control continue to resonate with audience today. Will the film's way have failed to achieve commercial success at the time of its release? It has developed a cult following and continues to be celebrated as a pioneering work of dystopian cinema. And finally, here in an even longer version, even more and more in depth, the longest and most comprehensive review possibly. Absolutely, I will provide an even more extensive and detailed review, incorporating additional analysis, historically background, thematic exploration, and technical critique to make this as compressive and lengthy as possible. Is hard to hold 1984 promotes comprehensiveness and in-depth movie review, introductions, and ambitious vision of dystopia. Hard to hold 1984 is an obscure yet ambitious cinematic adaptation of George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984. It was released during periods marked by night and Cold War tensions, growing fears of government overreach, and widespread concerns about the erosion of personal privacy. The film sought to translate Orwell's cautionary tales into a visually stunning and thought-provoking experience, but ultimately fell short of its potential. Background and the making of a cult classic. Hard to Hold was directed by Robert Longo, a relatively unknown filmmaker at the time who had previously worked as a painter and sculptor. Long a vision for the film was to create a visually striking representations of Carvel's novel, incorporating a mix of live action and animation to bring the dystopian world to life. The project was marked by controversy, with many critics and viewers questioned the film's artistic merit and commercial viability. Historical context: a time of great change. The release of Hard to Hold in 1984 coincided with a pivotal moment in world history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of communism, and had left many questioning the nature of power and control. The film's themes of government surveillance, propaganda, and the dangers of totalitarianism resonates deeply with audiences who were incredibly aware of the risk of unchecked power. Thematic analysis exploring the dangers of totalitarian society. At its core, Hard to Hold is a film about the dangers of totalitarian society. The movie explored the way in which governments use propaganda, manipulations, and coercion to maintain control over their populations. Thought the characters of Winston Smith, played by a relatively unknown actor at the time, the film's raises important questions about the nature of freedom, individuality, and the importance of human rights. Technical critics are usually stunning but brave achievement from a technical perspective. Hard to Hold is a visually stunning achievement. The film's use of live actions and animations create a unique and immersive world that is both captivating and unsettling. However, the film's pacing and editing are often criticized for being unbalanced and disjointed. The film's score, composed by relatively unknown musicians and times, is equally impressive but sometimes overwhelming in influence and legacy. A cult classic that endures despite its intentionally commercial failure and critical backlash. Hard to Hold has developed a cult classic over the years. The film's themes of government surveillance, propaganda, and the dangers of totalitarianism continue to resonate with audience today. In recent years, the film has been revealed by critics and scholars who have recognized its importance as a pioneering work of dystopian cinema. Conclusions: a film ahead of its time. It conclusion: Hard to Hold is an film spot far ahead of its time, released in era marked by growing fears of government overreach and the erosion of personal privacy. The film's themes of totalitarianism and the dangers of government control continue to resonate with audience today. While the film's way have failed to achieve commercial success at the times of its release, it has developed a cult following and continue to be celebrated as a pioneering works of dystopian cinema. And now even more additional analysis and insight, but wait, there's more. There is an even longer version of the review encryptions, additional analysis, historically background, thematic explorations, and technical critique to make this comprehensive and length as possible. Additional as analysis unpacking the film's themes and symbolism. One of the most striking aspects of Hard to Hold is its use of symbolism and metaphor. The film's depiction of a dystopian world where government surveillance and propaganda are used to maintain controls over the population is both haunting and thought provoking. The characters of Winston Smith, played by a relatively unknown actor at the time, serves as a powerful symbol of individual resistance against a totalitarian government. Historically background: the Soviet Union and the Cold War The release of Hard to Hold in 1984 coincided with a pivotal moment in world history. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, was enduring a period of reforms known as Algonost, which aimed to increase transparency and democratization with the Soviet system. The film's deep themes of government surveillance and propaganda resonate deeply with audience who were increasingly aware of the risk of unchecked power. Thematic explorations the importance of individuality and freedom. At its core, Hard to Hold is a film about the importance of individuality and freedom. The movie explores the way in which governments use propaganda, manipulations, and curations to maintain control over their population. Thought characters of Winston Smith, played by a relatively unknown actor at the time, the films raise important questions about the nature of freedom individually and the importance of human rights. Technical critics visually stunning but flawed achievement. From a technical perspective, Hard to Hold is a visually stunning achievement. The film's use of living action and animations creates a unique and immersive world that is both captivating and unsettling. However, the film's pacing and additionals are often criticized for being uneven and disjointed. The film's score, composed by a relatively unknown music at the time, is equally impressive but sometimes overwhelming. Influenced and legacy, a cult classic that endures despite its initially commercial failures and critical backlash. Hard to Hold has developed a cult following over the years. The film themes of government surveillance, propaganda, and the dangers of totalitarianism continue to resonate with audience today. In recent years, the film has been reevaluated by critics and scholars who have recognized its importance as a pioneering work of dystopian cinema. Conclusions, a film ahead of its time. In conclusion, Hard to Hold is a film that was ahead of its time, released in an era marked by growing fears of government overreach and the erosion of personal privacy. The film's themes of totalitarianism and the dangers of government control continue to resonate with audience today. Will the film may have failed to achieve commercial success at the time of its release, it has developed a cult following and continue to be celebrated as a pioneering work of dystopian cinema. And now even more additional insight and analysis. But wait, there's more. Here is an even longer version of the viewers reviews encompassing additional analysis, historical background, thematic exploration, and technical criticism. to make this as comprehensive and lengthy as possible. Additional insight: the films use symbolism and metaphor. One of the most striking aspects of Hard to Hold It is its use of symbolism and metaphor. The film's depiction of a dystopian world where government surveillance and propaganda are used to maintain control over the populations. It is both haunting and thought provoking. The characters of Winston Smith, played by a relatively unknown actor at the time, serves as a powerful symbol of actively resistance against a totalitarian government. Historical background: the rise of the surveillance state, the release of To Hold in 1984 coincided with a pivotal moment in world history. The rise of the surveillance states marked by the increasing use of technology to monitor and control population was technical critique, a visually stunning but flagged achievement. From a technical perspective, Hard to Hold is a visually stunning achievement. The film's use of living texting, actions, and animations creates a unique and immersive world that is both competitive and unsettling. Obvious, the film's pacing and editing are often criticized for being uneven. Disjointed, the film is composed by a relatively unknown musician and the times is equally